Hi, everyone. I'm Laura Freed, Director of Active Cultures, and I would like to warmly welcome you, along with our esteemed participants, to this afternoon's program, Microbes, Fermentation, and Makgeolli, produced in partnership with Gyopo. First, on behalf of both Gyopo and Active Cultures, I invite you to join us in acknowledging that as two organizations based in Los Angeles, we live on and benefit from the ancestral and unceded territory of the indigenous groups in the area that comprise our county, the Gabrielino, Tongva, Chumash, and the Fernandeño Tataviam peoples. Since our activities are shared digitally to the internet, let's also take a moment to consider the legacy of colonization embedded within these technologies, their structures and ways of thinking they propagate. In order to be here today, we are making use of equipment and high-speed internet not always available in many indigenous communities because of structural settler colonial racism. Additionally, these technologies, central to the work we do and the conversations we cultivate, leave significant carbon footprints, contributing to changing climates that disproportionately affect indigenous peoples worldwide. I invite you to join me in acknowledging all of this, as well as our shared responsibility to make good of this time and to consider our roles in decolonization, reconciliation, and reparation. Before we begin, some technical wayfinding for you all. The chat feature has been disabled for this event. If you're having technical issues or you would like to ask our panelists a question at any time during the panel, please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. To view live closed captioning, please click the CC symbol in the control bar in the bottom right of your screen. We will have a two-person ASL interpretation team here today. We will be spotlighting their windows, and interpreter should be visible in their names. Thank you to the wonderful Gyopo committee volunteers and to AC's team, all behind the curtain, for their help with production. With that, I'm so pleased to be able to introduce this program, the first in a series of events we are thrilled to host with Gyopo and focused on the practice and project of brewer Yong Ha Jeong. We at Active Cultures have been looking forward to working with Gyopo for some time. And so we were thrilled by the opportunity to center a multifaceted collaboration on Yong Ha's work and fermentation practices. She is a nuanced practitioner and critical thinker who, while working primarily with wild yeast fermentation, has developed her craft through the lens of interrogating notions of Korean heritage, identity, and scientific inquiry. Our larger collaboration, called Wild Fermentation, is a three-part series exploring the many facets and manifestations of wild fermentation and brewing, how it is informed by cultural and scientific research, and how a deeper appreciation for wild microorganisms can produce a rich examination in unpredictability, history, and politics. Later this spring, Active Cultures and Gyopo will host, along with Yong Ha, a special workshop, and Wild Fermentation will conclude with a gathering and meal to celebrate a time when we can come together again. Please stay tuned as we announce these events in the coming months. This afternoon, Yong Ha is joined by Victoria Lee and Charles Colmer to discuss the complex and intersectional topics around wild microorganisms and artisanal craft, from modernity and tradition to purity and complexity to taste and value. Conversations like these are vital for grounding critical practices like Yong Ha's firmly in our present moment by looking to the past and positing a future in which these practices and knowledge are met with care. For some context on our speakers today, and I'll introduce them now. Yong Ha is a traditional Korean music researcher turned Seoul brewer who was introduced to the world of Korean wild fermentation in 2012. Since then, she has studied Korean brewing technology informed by the alchemy of nuruk, which is a coarsely ground grain fermentation starter containing wild microorganisms. Central to her practice is what she calls the collaborative co-creation with wild microorganisms in nuruk and the indigenization of Korean Seoul in Los Angeles. Victoria Lee is an assistant professor of history at Ohio University and currently a fellow at the Institut d'études avancées de Paris. She received her PhD in the history of science from Princeton, and she is the author of The Arts of the Microbial World, Fermentation Science in 20th Century Japan, forthcoming from the University of Chicago Press this fall. Charles Colmer is a historian of microbiology, biotechnology, and biomedicine. His research focuses on how humans have repurposed living things as tools in industry, agriculture, medicine, and science, and how this shapes scientific knowledge of life. Currently, Charles is the Amundsen postdoctoral instructor in history of biology at the Division of the Humanities and Social Sciences at Caltech. His PhD dissertation, From Elephant to Bacterium, Microbial Culture Techniques and Chemical Orders of Nature, 1875 to 1946, is a history of how microbial culture techniques recast nature's order in chemical terms. Okay, I'll leave you all here for now. Gyopo Steering Committee member and Programs Co-Chair, Crystal Peck, will join you towards the end to moderate a Q&A with our speakers, drawing from your questions, and she will deliver our final thanks and toast. Thanks, Crystal. Thanks to all Gyopo members for your collaboration. It's such a pleasure to work with a wonderful community of cultural producers such as you. Thank you, Charles and Victoria, for sharing your work and ideas with us today, and especially to Yong Ha, with whom we are so honored to work. Please enjoy the conversation and drink. Yong Ha, I'll leave it to you. Thanks.
Thank you for the introduction, Laura. Thank you, Active Cultures. Thank you, Gyopo, for this opportunity to discuss with Charles Colmer and Victoria Lee. Thank you, Victoria Lee and Charles Colmer, for joining me. I am so grateful for their joining me on this conversation because as someone who's been navigating what is Korean, what is traditional, what is heritage. This began in the late 2000s when I was a PhD student studying Korean music. And at the time, I went into my academic program with fantasies of all Korean music to later learn that when my pansori teacher couldn't answer questions, it's because her teacher probably didn't answer her questions, because you do what your master teacher tells you to do. And so you don't question tradition. And I found that some of these parallels would occur in the school world as I was learning to brew, where things Korean were of the past and were from the past, and things modern were at odds with each other, when tradition is something that does come from the past and changes over time. So by inviting Charles Colmer and Victoria Lee, I think we'd, their historical perspectives and my ethnographic lens would, I think, be fruitful to de-essentialize what is Korean, and even in, products like these. So today, for those of you who have access to this, Los Angeles residents could get Hana Makgeolli, the first handcrafted makgeolli produced in the US. This you could get at Domaine LA. And thank you, Hana. Thank you, not Hannah. Thank you, Alice, for providing us your booze. We're so happy to try it out. Because Victoria is not in the US right now with limited access to this, she won't be able to drink this with us. But Charles, shall we have a drink?
Sure,
Yeah?
with pleasure. Absolutely. I'm noticing on the bottle it recommends to shake slightly in order to agitate it. Or do you have a feeling on this?
That's one way. I don't know what Alice's preference is for drinking this, but generally when you let the bottle, when you let it cold crash, maybe that's confusing. You put your alcohol in the fridge and then it separates. So this here, the clear layer here is called Cheongju or Yakju. And this part here, this is the Takju part. But you could also shake it up. And this is now Takju because it's mixed with the rice solids.
So because we are already dealing with a cloudy beverage, it seems that this is good to go.
Yes.
All right. Well, I will crack it open.
And I'll have to get myself some other fermented food later.
Oh. We have a mild explosion here. Okay. There it is.
Victoria, we will have to postpone a toast until you're back in the United States.
Yeah.
So this beverage here is at 16 ABV. Generally, makgeolli, commercially available makgeolli that most people are familiar with, it's this makgeolli. Charles, you ready?
Yeah.
Cheers. Thanks for joining me. Thank you for joining me, Victoria.
Yeah, thanks.
With pleasure. Thank you for the invitation.
It's good.
It's very good.
It's alive.
So yeah, it's very effervescent. The kind of you can feel the sort of vigorousness of the beverage.
And this is at 16 ABV, which is stronger than this makgeolli at 8 ABV. Oh, actually, this one's at 6 ABV, and this is one of the most popular brands in Korea and abroad for makgeolli. Would you like to try this one? And we could talk about the differences.
Sure, I'm willing to do a comparison. It doesn't seem like a fair comparison, but
I'm having a problem of shaking too much here today. Sorry, Charles, I already drank some before you. Impatient here. So those of you who are watching, Charles is drinking out of a tin cup, which is a post-war tradition, I will argue, even though it's not hundreds and hundreds of years old. The practice of drinking makgeolli and of industrially produced, mass-produced makgeolli in tin is, I think, very traditional, very Korean. It has become from the practice of that over the decades.
This is a very interesting comparison. In fact, they're just entirely different things. And I wouldn't say that I dislike the mass-produced version of this. It just seems like it's fitting for a different context, perhaps a very hot day, or it's refreshing, but somewhat simple, I would say, in its flavor. It's somewhat flat. It's very smooth and drinkable.
It is very smooth, very drinkable. It's definitely sweeter from the, I wonder if this one has aspartame. It's got a phenylalanine.
Phenylalanine?
Yes, thank you for pronouncing it, which is, I guess, part something found in aspartame, I believe. So that's added to stop it from fermenting, because the yeasts will keep fermenting the sugars into alcohol. I would like to take this moment to go over a few different terminologies. I think that would be helpful for the viewers. First thing is that the main difference between these two beverages is that Hana Makgeolli is produced with nuruk. I'm holding my master brewer's nuruk here. My teacher's his nuruk, and these are clumps of fermented wheat grains. It's called nuruk, and it contains all sorts of wild bacteria, fungi, and yeasts. And the way it's made is you coarsely grind up wheat or other grains. Generally, it's wheat, and you can mix the different grains too. You coarsely grind, mix water, pack it tightly into a cake, and you ferment that for about 30 days generally. Depends on the fermenter. And then it gets aged, and you use this as the main fermentation agent to make sul. Sul is the all-encompassing term for all Korean alcoholic beverages. Earlier we went over cheongju, yakju, which are the clear liquid beverages that you get in sul, and the takju's the cloudy parts. Now, this here is produced, it's mostly not fermented with nuruk. To produce makgeolli, you have to turn the rice starches into sugar. And so the fungi do the work for that. They turn the rice starches into sugar, and the yeasts will eat up the sugars to turn into alcohol. The complexity that you find in this beverage, this is definitely a lot more complex than this, is from the interaction of all the different wild microorganisms. And that is what got me into making makgeolli in 2012. Charles Colmer's, our mutual friend, asked me, do you want to, make makgeolli with me? I'm going to this place, this academy, and we're going to make some makgeolli. Do you want to do this? So I thought, oh, well, why not? It sounds really fun. And this was when I've never fermented anything, in 2012. And I didn't have Hana Makgeolli, but I had something similar made by very hardcore alcohol brewers who pour through old texts from hundreds of years ago to get at, this code of what is Korean brewing, because home brewing, the home brewing culture got decimated during the Japanese colonial period and the post-war period when Koreans were too poor, and legally it became at some point illegal to even brew with rice. So, and that is when you get the production of wheat-based makgeolli. But yes, the nuruk is really the magic. But nuruk is also somewhat resistant to industrialization. It's hard to scale. Charles, would you like to comment any further?
Oh, sure, absolutely. Thank you for that orientation, a crash course in this delicious beverage. I am very happy to think of members of our audience tasting this along with us and enjoying the Hana Makgeolli. It's a very special and delicious concoction. So we had organized our talk today, our conversation today, around a few key paired concepts, which we hoped would help us evoke some of the complexity of fermentation cultures. And so one of the paired concepts that we had spoken about is this relationship between modernity and tradition, and the ways in which tradition is at once something from the past, but it's also something that is with us in the present, that's reanimated and transformed by present day contexts. And so one of the reasons why it's been really interesting to speak with one another and also to speak with Victoria Lee about this is to think about how fermentation processes have changed with the introduction of new technologies, with the introduction of new organisms, and with growing scientific knowledge of the organisms involved in these processes. So with that in mind, we had hoped to open this conversation by thinking about what is Korean about makgeolli, whether we consume it in the mass-produced form or in a smaller batch form. And one of the interesting parts of our conversation with Victoria was to be able to ask, how does the Koreanness of makgeolli compare, for instance, to the Japaneseness of sake, or the sort of national identity of other fermented beverages, to kind of think about these things in comparison with one another?
This whole interaction between tradition and modernity, I was really excited to come in and talk to Yong Ha and Charles about this, because that was actually what got me into the whole subject of studying Japanese fermentation science in the 20th century. I come from a science background, and so we associate that with knowledge that's very standardized, sort of almost a direct opposite to this process of apprenticeship and learning brewing, although one does also learn science through this sort of person-to-person apprenticeship and training. It's also very disciplinarian, but sort of looking at Japanese microbiology in the 20th century, it was really interesting to me how distinctive some of that rhetoric was about borrowing the power of microbes and sort of microbes as living workers, and that sort of wasn't something that was like microbiology elsewhere, and that got me into the connections with traditional brewing in Japan, the connections between science and craft traditions in Japan. And so that interaction between science and industry that had been there before the importation of these standardized techniques through the 20th century was what captured me about the subject, the complexity of it. Koji itself today it's supposed to be the national brewing microbe, the national microbe, in fact, of Japan. That's sort of how it's been labeled by the Brewing Society of Japan. But originally, in the 19th century, when scientists started sort of studying koji to sort of help brewers improve the industry, to sort of aid Japanese industrialization more generally, all of these molds that were used to make alcohol, whether they were in China or in Vietnam or they said in India or wherever it was, they called it koji. It would just be, oh, this is Japanese koji, this is Chinese koji. These are mold preparations. And it was, after this that the scientists started assigning, names, species to different kinds of molds that gradually in the 20th century, that association between a particular species, koji, and Japaneseness started to develop. And this was also in a context not just of industrialization, but also of Japanese imperialism. So all of these things were mutually interacting, and it's not sort of, one's not able to separate those processes. So how koji became something Japanese alone, and then other names might be used for other molds, other Asian brewing molds. But it was very clear that there were, many historical commonalities, many historical interactions between these different regions. And even in Japan alone, in the Japanese archipelago, there were lots of different traditions of fermenting. I don't know if you might have heard of kuchi kamizake, which is a saliva sake, sort of chewed. It's made by chewing plant material in the mouth and then spitting it into the rice or whatever it is that you're fermenting, and then the enzymes from the saliva actually do the fermentation. And in some versions of Japanese culture, that is sort of seen as the primeval Japanese tradition. And then koji came along, and then there was Japanese sake, but originally things were, everyone was making things like kuchi kamizake, this saliva method. So there's sort of this whole diversity of traditions as well within the Japanese archipelago, but somehow in the 20th century, koji became Japanese. And yeah, just the historicity of that is interesting to me.
Yes, and this is exactly why I wanted you to join us in this conversation, because not that, the construction of nuruk has the same parallels as the construction of Japaneseness in koji. I mean, these two beverages that we just, drank are tasting now. Which is more Korean than the other, which is more traditional. I guess this is more traditional, you could argue, in the sense that this sort of practice has been practiced for hundreds of years, but even then you'd have to wonder what that really means, because the nuruk that's commercially available today is very different from the nuruk produced regionally in the homes of Yangban, the literati class, who were, homebrewing to give gifts, to entertain guests, but mostly to worship ancestors. And that is why, Korea doesn't have, you could say, although soju is the most globalized Korean beverage, probably one of the most popular distilled beverages actually in the world. It's very, very popular all over now. So the purists like to think that alcohol only made with this is traditional alcohol. But one could also argue that, this is also very traditional in the sense that, it's a rainy day. You go out with your friends, your family, and you have some fried savory pancakes and, wash it down with this. I think that's perfectly, a wonderful eating experience, dining experience one could have. And you could also, go to one of the more, new Korean alcohol dining joints where you could, pay a lot more for something like this hanamakgeolli, which is quite good. They're totally different beverages, and I think they both have a place in the spectrum of Korean traditionality, food-wise, that is.
I think that comparison is quite interesting, Yong Ha, and it brings to mind how questions of identity and questions of authenticity in relation to culture, and especially food culture, are quite complicated. And I think this is something that we're acutely aware of now, with a lot of conversations that are going on about who is the right person to kind of promote certain features of a food culture, what would constitute appropriation, these kinds of questions that are very much in the news. One of the interesting places, so we heard a bit from Victoria earlier about the koji narrative, and we've heard a bit from you about the nuruk narrative. One of the interesting places where these narratives, of course, converge is in the colonial period. And something that I found very interesting reading about in preparation for our conversation was thinking about how Korean alcohol production processes were changing in response to the colonization in the 20th century, beginning in 1910, I believe. And so this sort of started me thinking about all the different facets of brewing. Brewing involves many different ingredients, techniques, knowledge, instruments, and so to see how these have changed over the course of history has been quite interesting. And I wondered if we might talk about that a little bit together. Perhaps we could reflect more about. You gave us a nice crash course in Noruk, but perhaps thinking about rice or other grains that were used in alcohol production, how this was changing, in response to crises such as war, occupation, famine, dictatorship, all of these things. It changed. These were changes in the landscape, which in turn changed the practices of brewing, which I found fascinating to read about.
Yes. Where should I start? There's so much to say on this. So I think one of the things, so when talking about tradition, what is tradition? Sorry, Charles, this is going to be like a little bit tangential to answer your question. We're taking this roundabout way, but these questions of, because this is now, we're still thinking about tradition and modernity and how these can be kind of, false dichotomies. I think a lot of people like to think about, Korean modernity as a thing that happened to them directly via Japanese colonialism. It is, yes, it is, but there were also narratives of enlightenment, very much influenced by Western thinkers. They were in response to Western expansionism and, Korea being, between China, great powers, China and Japan, Korea had to, there were some Korean intellectuals who are trying to create a national narrative, an identity, a national identity, which is constructed by folklorists and other writers who wanted to think about Korean, what is unique to Korea, because the relations between China and Korea has been ongoing. And when we think about, koji, nuruk, and molds, they all did come from China. And of course, they get localized and change over time. In the context of Korea, you have nuruk, and this is very roundabout way to answer.
I see the connection quite clearly, and to add to this sort of complex geographic narrative that you are relating to our audience. If we look at the history of soju, for instance, then we have to think about how distilling technologies were brought over during the period of Mongol imperialism in the 13th and 14th centuries. So the point being, technologies don't stop at national borders. Mm-hmm. Brewing, knowledge of brewing does not stop at national borders. So it's quite a curious process for brewers and historians alike to think about how certain things take on this character of a nationality.
Yeah. So when purists speak about national alcohol, they locate the Korean soul in the nuruk, but you know, and then they speak of the use of koji in makgeolli production because, you know, all this commercially available mass-produced stuff, you have to use koji. You can't get that sort of saccharification power consistency with nuduk. You're just not. With ambient microorganisms, it's not going to happen. So, you know, so commercializing such a product with nuduk's very, very challenging, and it's also something that I'm still working on. But you know, the availability of ingredients, legal changes. For one thing, banning of home brewing in the earlier 20th century during colonial rule by Japan definitely changed the way we brewed. For example, I think a lot of people who make makgeolli at home do the Tanyangju method, the one-step method. And for those of you who are interested in the second part of this series, we're doing a Tanyangju fast and risky makgeolli. And that way of home brewing is actually not the preferred method. And it's only become popular because during the colonial period, you can't brew. You're going to get fined for brewing at home. So you have to figure out a way to brew faster. So you do the one-step method rather than like the two-step or three-step method. I believe Hana makgeolli is a samyangju, which is a three-step method. And the idea is that every time you do another, you add the different stages in the brewing, theoretically, the alcohol, the beverage should be more complex. But you also do the first step to create generally, if you're doing two-step, three-step work or other brewing, when you add more brewing stages, the first, the foundational brew, which we call mitsul, is when you have some sort of cooked rice. It could be in the form of a porridge. It could be half-cooked porridge. It could be different types of dok or rice cake mixed in with the nuduk and water. And what happens is the yeast propagate, they multiply. And when the yeast cell count increases, you then feed the mash with steamed rice or more porridge or other starches. Now that was the preferred method to create really delicious beverages because doing an amazing tanyangju, a one-step method, is incredibly difficult and risky because there might not be enough, yeast to produce alcohol. Now, the tanyangju method is the method that my grandma knows. It's the method, it's the only method she knows. And when she watches me make makgeolli, she gets very confused. She thinks, why are you doing, this porridge thing? And why don't you put enough water or this and then? You said, no, Granny, there are different ways of doing things. Now, but I could understand why my grandma only knew that one method, because it became illegal to brew, and that was the method that got passed on. So, yeah, that explains why most people only know the tanyangju method, and the artisans, they got pushed out. That knowledge didn't get transferred. And only recently, in the last few decades, have there been reconstructionists, some hardcore brewers, most of whom are male nationalists that have, really advanced or made, Korean homebrewing more popular.
I suppose it sort of recalls in a very indirect way, for me, the way in which Japanese scientists at the turn of the 20th century were encouraging brewers to use pure cultures of koji and also yeast. Koji, it was separated. Koji spore making was separated off as its own specialized industry. So breweries were used to purchasing spores from outside. But for yeast, that wasn't the case at the turn of the 20th century. And so what these scientists were telling the brewers was, stop making the moto preparation, which is the preparation where you mix koji with water and rice in a particular way. It's very slow, and that propagates yeast in the ferment, and that becomes the yeast starter, the moto, but it's sort of wild ambient yeast. And the scientists were telling them, stop doing that, and just take our pure cultured yeast that we are preparing for you at the National Brewing Experiment Station, and you won't get contaminating yeast. You'll just get this pure yeast, and it'll be fast. I mean, you don't have to make your moto, which is a really difficult process. And but the brewers really pushed back against the yeast part, not the koji part so much, but the pure cultures of yeast, because it altered the complexity of the taste of the sake. So it took until 1960 before brewers actually started using strains of pure cultured yeast. And even then, they would often take different strains of yeast and mix them together, to try to recreate this complexity of taste of the sake. And then part of that interaction, part of the conclusions that came out of that interaction were that you couldn't really associate a particular yeast with a particular taste. Mm-hmm. And in the same way, you couldn't really associate a particular koji strain with a particular taste. Mm-hmm. Because if that were the case, I mean, if there are actually very few specialist koji spore starter makers, and so people are purchasing, strains that are quite standardized from only maybe, I think, 6 distribute nationally in Japan. And if it were the case that that strain determined the taste of the sake, then all the sake would taste the same. So that can't possibly be the case. So there's just sort of this enormous complexity that whether it's cultured pure or whether it's not cultured pure, that's only part of the story, I think. Yeah.
I think that resonates with one of the key insights of many historians of technology who have drawn our attention to the way that technologies are always interacting with one another in complex and interesting ways. So we can, for instance, talk about pure culture techniques as something, a significant event in this history that we're looking at together. But then we also have to think about how those techniques were in conversation and competition with a whole number of different considerations that went into the brewing process. And one of the interesting things that I feel has emerged from our conversations leading up to this talk, this panel, was thinking about some of the ways in which the scientific vocabulary seems promising, but maybe ultimately doesn't capture the essence of what's important in brewing. And brewing has its own goals and own kind of emphases, which should be given respect and space to develop.
I suppose, actually, I want to add something to what you just said there, Charles, because it sort of suggests that there's a fundamental incompatibility between, the complexity of brewing and the standardization of science. Mm-hmm. And what I actually found looking at this interaction between scientists and brewers was that in some ways, they were actually very compatible. So in the koji industry, which is a different story from yeast pure culture techniques were picked up pretty quickly by the koji spore specialists. And I think that was partly because of the way the labor was organized, that they were already separated off as specialists. So you didn't have this, outside organization, the government, experiment station under the Ministry of Finance, because it was so important. Alcohol was so important for tax, like pushing these yeasts on you. And essentially these are scientists who you don't know if they've been trained as brewers or whatever, although some of them, came from brewing families. But with koji spore starters, they were already specialists in handling these molds even before there was a concept of of microbe. So they had all these sensory techniques to be able to distinguish between different cultures. You know, they could smell them, they could look at the color of the spores, you know, they could, you know, touch them and see if they were, you know, dry or moist. And they could kind of tell there were different methods of producing these spores as well. And they could make those fine distinctions about, well, who is the producer? Is this done in the Kyoto style? Is this done in the Osaka style? You know, this sort of, these kinds of differences. And Koji spore specialists had to be really good at distinguishing those because their whole reputation depended on it. They were selling these things. So they really refined these techniques. They weren't always split off as a separate industry. That was a historical development again. So that's, I don't want to essentialize that either. But they, when scientists came along and had these, you know, pure culture techniques, oh, you know, here's a microscope, you know, here are some chemical analytical techniques that you can use to see like what your koji is producing or whatever, then it just gave them another way to be able to make those distinctions more finely. They already knew how to kind of save the koji that they like the most and preserve it and try to propagate that next time and, you know, select between the different molds. And all these scientific techniques of pure culture gave them another, you know, more ways to do what they were already doing essentially. So they picked that up very quickly. But the scientists also got something back from the brewers. They, you know, got the strains so they could study them in the lab, and they found, you know, koji is actually, you know, they're very interesting microbes in terms of the enzymes they produce, and you know, they're bioactive because they brew. So they were interesting to scientists in that sense. But they also kind of picked up this broader attitude from the brewers that lasted very far into the 20th century. This idea that, well, molds, I mean, microbes are not, you know, just disease-causing things. They're very, they're very kind of complex organisms that exist in ecology. There are many different kinds of species and strains in a ferment, in the brew. They interact in particular ways to create the product. And you can kind of borrow their power to make other things like antibiotics, you know, drugs, flavors like MSG, which is now fermented by tinkering with them. And that's an attitude that they got from the brewers as well. So there was they were not incompatible. It was quite the opposite.
That's a helpful, thank you for pointing that out. And I didn't mean to overstate the distinction between brewing knowledge and scientific knowledge. I think there's much overlap and gradations between these kinds of ways of knowing things and ways of interacting with microbes. And it's precisely those kind of points of contact, places in the middle that are most interesting. And a question I wanted to ask Yong Ha, in terms of the sort of signs of empirical signs that you might have during your brewing, are there certain sensations that you love or that stand out to you, you know, a smell or a texture or a sort of visual cue that, you know, the microbes are doing well, I'm doing well, this process is going the way I want it to be. I guess I was wondering about kind of the sensory experiences of brewing, and what is useful for you.
You know, the sensory knowledge is, and what you see, what you taste, what you feel, and then it becomes a part of this, like, I guess, body knowledge. And I haven't quite parsed this out yet. And this is why I guess you apprentice under people and try to catch these things. To go over them would be, I think, wouldn't really make sense to people who don't brew. So I won't go into the details of that. But, you know, when you know that your mash is sweet, probably not a good time to add you know, more steamed rice, you probably want to reduce the pH a little bit. Things like that, you know, you taste. If it's sweet, sometimes you know it's ready, sometimes not. You wait for things to be a little bit more tart. But some, you know, but then there are also, if you're doing multiple stage brews, your mash can be still sweet, noticeably sweet, and the yeast will, you know, eat, propagate, and things happen. I mean, my hame soju teacher, when he does his hame soju, you know, for some of his mash, when he adds subsequent rice, steamed rice to his mash, sometimes the mash is a bit sweet. And I was very surprised at first, but it works. But there's so many factors involved in wild fermentation, especially when you're fermenting with so many different microorganisms that haven't been studied empirically. I'm sure that some of the bigger breweries, they have their research and design team with all sorts of information that I would love to get access to, but until there is a more, you know, collaborative spirit between researchers and brewers who really know the, you know, the who know the recipes and understand Korean brewing from the historical texts. I think that sort of collaboration will be very, very fruitful. Now, sometimes this sort of interaction doesn't happen because of narratives that seem to dominate all sorts of, you know, fields, like even makgeolli making. So when koji is considered Japanese, people won't use it. Of course, there are different kinds of koji strains too, and there are breweries in Korea that are experimenting and mixing different koji strains too. And this is something that's happening in some of the newer sakes, where they're adding a lot more. Some of the breweries are using not just Aspergillus oryzae, but Leucoensis, which has more citric acid. And things are changing. So I think, yeah, I really wish that there is a less rigid sort of understanding of what is Korean, because of course what is Korean is constantly shifting over time. Another example I could illustrate is, you know, there's a brewery in Korea called Yangchon. I think it's called the Yangchon Brewery. They use Aspergillus oryzae. They make, but then they make their own Aspergillus oryzae koji, and they do it with wheat, which is not usually what that is considered very, very un-Korean to some. But this is something they've been doing for so many years, and people drink it and associate that beverage with Koreanness. So these sort of, you know, simplistic one-to-one associations, I think that, you know, that stem from early nationalist, 20th century nationalist narratives to carve out like a unique Korean national Korean culture that isn't Japanese or Chinese, have really prevented in some ways the more fruitful interactions that could, I think, spearhead my alcohol industry.
Well,
The wheat part of the koji is not, it wasn't originally Japanese either. It was was used when, it came in when alcohol was industrialized in Japan for actually for fuel substitution during the Asia Pacific War. And to sort of scale up alcohol for production, Japanese industry practitioners started adding wheat to the koji. But the wheat that came, that whole practice actually came from Takamine Jokichi, who in the early 20th century, he was trying to apply koji to make whiskey instead of malt. And he came up with this preparation that had wheat in it. And he didn't manage to industrialize the whiskey, but the preparation with koji, but the preparation became very popular as a stomach digestive called takadiastase. But that had a good enzymatic saccharification power. So people started using it in alcohol factories at the industrial scale in Japan, but not koji on its own. So during the Second World War, that technology was actually combined with an industrialized version of a Chinese practice, and they called this amylo. So it's using rhizopus and mucor microbes and not only aspergillus. And Japanese practitioners in a celebratory way called it the amylo-koji eclectic method. And that sort of fit with some of the sort of ideologies of the Japanese imperial period, essentializing koji as Japanese, essentializing rhizopus and mucor as Chinese, and then sort of mixing the two and saying that this is, the sort of this Pan-Asianism of the imperial period. But like a lot of the ways that those things were essentialized came out of that particular period. But yeah, just sort of a spin off on what you were saying about the wheat.
Yeah, and rhizopus it's in here too.
Yeah.
It has Aspergillus oryzae, all kinds of different fungi. That's a thing. It is a Pan-Asian thing, but because of historical moments, Japan and Korea no longer speak of Pan-Asianism.
I think it returns us to a concept that came up in your bio, Yong Ha, the idea of indigenization, or conversely nationalization, the kind of processes through which things come to belong to a certain place. And one question that is on my mind that I wanted to ask you during this conversation is, what does it mean for you to be practicing this brewing in Los Angeles? A sort of silly thought, earlier you mentioned that the kind of industrial makgeolli is something we have on a rainy day with a pancake, but in Los Angeles the rainy days are few and far between. So right. Perhaps what would the new ritual, or what would the new tradition look like in a kind of diasporic context?
Well, I congratulate Hana Makgeolli for producing craft makgeolli. So keep on going. And when I get my brewery going, these are, Charles, I can't answer that question. It's a big question. What I would like is to eventually have some very serious students who will toil and under me and learn and really question, to learn deeply what is Korean brewing historically, but also be open to, innovation and change. So Yangchon Brewery, the example I illustrated earlier with their production of koji with wheat, with ground up wheat, is that happened because Korea got a lot of wheat from the States after the war, and at some point, Korean alcohol, you weren't allowed to make makgeolli with rice. You're going to tell people that when they brew with any nuduk, if they brew wheat with nuduk, if they make makgeolli with only wheat, with wheat nuduk, is that not Korean? I would say surely not. Now, if we can make makgeolli with corn, why not? if we could use all sorts of bacteria, fungi, and yeasts, and the interaction of those microorganisms to, break down corn and turn that into alcohol. I'm for it. That's my position.
Would you describe yourself as an experimentalist, perhaps?
I don't know. I guess my introduction to makgeolli was, I went to this bar. Most of the makgeolli I knew was this. This was the makgeolli I knew. But because I grew up in the States, I didn't drink much of it. And actually never really drank until I went to Korea for ethnographic research. And then you realize you have to drink to do research in Korea. That's when people tell you all the interesting things when they're drinking. But I don't know. I don't know. Sometimes I'm a purist, sometimes I'm a traditionalist, sometimes I say it doesn't matter, let's break all the rules. I think it's very situational. Yeah. It's hard to say because I'm still trying to answer these questions for myself, and having conversations with you, Charles, and Victoria, it opens up different ways of thinking about what I do, and also, some of the parallels you might be finding in different fermentation practices that can be very helpful. As for myself, I used to go to a brewery in the Bay Area to learn to do beer. And one of the things that I learned in 2012 at Tsusubori, where I first went for alcohol instruction, is that, to do makgeolli well, you got to learn all sorts of different brewing, technologies and knowledge. And this is how you make better alcohol. Yeah. But I want to add that one of my goals is to serve makgeolli with Mexican food.
That
one
sounds
of
like
my things I'd like to accomplish in LA.
Fitting LA tradition, LA tradition in the making.
I think it goes very well together. They go very well. And people serve sake with cheese now. Why not have a sandwich with makgeolli or sake? Why not? Right? Julia Child did it. We can do it too. Why should Korean alcohol only be drunk with Korean food? Right?
And anyway, for a while, the most, I think still the most popular drink in Japan is beer, not sake. And yeah,
Exactly.
sake has the way it's been promoted is in this nostalgic way in some ways to compete with beer.
Right. And the way that sake will be marketed to appeal to Western audiences and people outside of Japan will shift maybe drastically. I imagine the sake market in the US is growing a lot. Nihonshu, Japanese drink, marketing it that way in outside of Japan probably wouldn't work. And I know, there are breweries now trying to promote their sake to go with, Western foods. And there's a brewery in Oakland called Den Sake. They, I think, are also adding Lucuensis koji to create a little bit more tartness.
Lucuensis coming originally from awamori rather than from sake. So awamori being
right.
the traditional drink of the Ryukyu Islands.
And so that's and it's not even from, if I'm not wrong, it wasn't isolated from, it wasn't necessarily like an awamori strain either. Right. So that's also constructed, and so you have a shochu fungi now being used to produce, mass-produced makgeolli. It's very interesting, and I look forward to more discussions and opportunities to collaborate with scientists and with other brewers, which I think will be very, very helpful for the Korean alcohol industry. Yeah. I think it's a good time to take some questions.
Sure. Well, thank you so much, Yong Ha, Victoria, and Charles for such an amazing and nuanced conversation. We could listen to you, probably for another hour. So again, my name is Crystal Peck, and I'll be moderating a Q&A with all of you, including our audience. I want to thank our audience for the wonderful questions that you've shared. Just to note, because of time constraints, we won't be able to address all of the questions, but we'll do our very best to touch upon a range of different issues. So the first question I want to ask is actually for Victoria from Sonja Swanson. And the question is regarding koji. So would you say that pre-standardized Japanese sake more closely resembled Korean sul?
Can you repeat the question, Crystal?
Sure.
Korean sul?
Yeah, so regarding koji, would you say that pre-standardized Japanese sake more closely resembled Korean sul, so sake?
I actually don't want to come down on that question in the sense that I don't feel that I know enough about Korean sul and to sort of exactly draw that comparison, but also that if you put a scientist there to answer that question as well. I mean, I don't know about somebody who's a connoisseur of taste, that might be a different issue, but if you sort of, imagine putting a scientist there tasting pre-standardized Japanese sake or tasting or investigating Korean sul, and what actually stood out to these scientists at the beginning wasn't this strain is the essential nature of this drink, or it was actually the variety that they found in all of the products. So you imagine they'd be looking at koji strains or microbial strains, not just koji, lactobacilli, yeasts, in soy sauce, in sake, and all kinds of fermented products. And then what they actually found was the huge diversity in each of the products, in the rooms where the products were made. Like if you go to a koji room, or if you go to a brewery and you put petri dishes around the room and collect the microbes that fall in them and you analyze them later, there's many different microbes. Some are good, some are, don't do a lot in brewing when you investigate their function, some are contaminating, but just sort of the sheer number of them. And then when they started to characterize them as well, then they found a lot of differences between strains that were all found in different kinds of sake from around the country. I'm talking about Japan here, for example, and they started to try to draw distinctions. Okay, so if you take a look at all the Aspergillus oryzae that you're isolating from soy sauce, that whole group over there, versus the whole group that you isolated from sake, then perhaps the differences are greater between the strains found in sake and strains found in soy sauce than the strains found, between the strains found in the sake or something. But this is they were doing it at the same time as they knew, okay, these are the strains used for sake, these are the strains used for soy sauce. So when they were, classifying these strains, sort of thinking about what were the significant differences between them, they were aware that these were functionally different industries. And this was the same when they were looking at, products in other parts of Asia outside of Japan, or, different kinds of products in Japan, like shochu or aomori. And they already had that in mind, that okay, this is a different industry. Perhaps we should call this a different species. And so there was a little bit of a battle to say, to have it recognized internationally that sake koji and soy sauce koji are different species, for example, because it's also very complicated where you draw the species line. I mean, I couldn't say on the question of taste from the scientific perspective, then I think it's also quite debatable.
Yong Ha, I saw you nodding a lot. Did you want to add anything to that, maybe?
You know, there are some older Japanese folks who say that, you know, they miss more complex sake from the past, but I don't know what that is. So it makes me wonder, and there's more interest in Dobroku sake. One of the sake breweries here are producing it. I'm very excited to try it at some point soon. Yeah, I mean, there's also so many regional differences in approach. And for one thing, like home brewing in Korea, it was home brewing. So each home had their own way of doing things. I mean, they weren't necessarily making nuruk in like a room, which is done now, like which is like a more of a colonial, Japanese colonial period introduced shelf method of making nuruk in a room. So you wouldn't have necessarily like the same microorganisms hanging out like in a brewery. And so if you have this complex of amazing microorganisms, then more or less you're gonna probably get really delicious alcohol. So while it wasn't practiced like that, I mean, I'm sure there were certain techniques, the availability, the use of certain rice, or maybe the way they fermented the nuruk. There are different ways of making nuruk. Some people ferment it only for 21 days. I know some people who do it for 40 days and age the nuruk for, you know, a few months after that. So the practices really vary. And not all of the practices survive. And I guess those with more visibility and promotion get to, you know, claim authenticity or, yeah, a Koreanness to it, if you will.
Well, that dovetails a little bit with the second question that is actually for you, Yong Ha. So this is from Jeffrey U. Warren. So the question is the production of nuruk recently revived, given what you mentioned about the loss of practices under occupation, and how has your makgeolli been influenced by your residency in the US? Or by your time in the US. So let me read that question just one more time. So the question is the production of nuruk recently revived, given what you mentioned about the loss of practices under occupation, and then how has your makgeolli been influenced, you know, by sort of your time in the U.S. or being raised in the U.S. or coming, you know, spending time in the U.S. I think that's how the question was posed or framed.
Okay, well, there are a few nuruk masters in Korea. You cannot get consistent nuruk from them, period. So while there are many people making nuruk, and it's being practiced, but there is no major, at the scale that this is produced, there is no single brewery producing with nuruk, with just ambient microorganisms. Now, as for my experience in the States, I think when I first got to learning about makgeolli making, I thought if you learn like a recipe or two, then you do it, you know, like if you learn if you know a really good baker and they teach you exactly how to do a cookie, maybe it won't taste the same, but it could be darn good. And then I realized, wait, no, this is actually a lot more difficult than I thought. You know, when you're learning to brew, you're not necessarily being told, okay, what at this pH level, you do this. And when you get this gravity, you do that. You don't have that in the way that alcohol instruction is introduced in most of the academies in Korea. Now that is changing, but because it's so brewer specific, I think it's hard to kind of have a standardized rubric to do that. Not to mention, like, it all depends on the kind of noodle you're using. So the same recipe with the same sort of rice, water content, made with this noodle will be very different from commercially available noodle.
Thank you so much, Yong Ha. So our third question is actually for Charles. And the question is, can you speak a bit about the transformative powers of microorganisms and how they inform our understanding of history of place? Do you want me to read that again? Or?
No, I think I grasped the question. The last phrase was history of place. So one thing that brings to mind, there was an adage by a microbiologist in the late 19th century, Martinus Beijerinck. He's a Dutch microbiologist, perhaps most famous for describing viruses, or what came to be known as viruses for the first time. But he said kind of famously, everything is everywhere and the environment decides. And that turns out not to be the case, but it's a very appealing idea. The idea that around us, all microbial life is present, and it's really just the kind of availability of nutrients that encourages some to grow over others. I think that in the meantime, environmental microbiologists have discerned that environment matters more than Beijerinck was giving it credit at the time. But nonetheless, I think what's interesting here is that when we're talking about microorganisms, we're talking about very small things beyond the threshold of perception, and they are everywhere. They are ubiquitous. And it's quite interesting then to think about how place can matter. And so when it comes to brewing, we talked earlier about the availability of ingredients and kind of the inputs into brewing processes, but there are also interesting stories, for instance, about pollution. So forms of pollution change the environment and encourage some microbes to grow over others. The point being that the growth of microorganisms is it's happening everywhere, but it is responding to very specific conditions in different places. And I think this is a source of historical fascination and scientific fascination as well.
Thank you so much, Charles. And I think our last question that we'll ask, and this is for all of you, is a question from Alex Kim. So the question is, I've been interested in how rituals, folk music, and other cultural practices might be read as a kind of memory storage system for scientific and practical knowledge, like work songs as timekeeping or salt offerings in miso production. In your work as researchers and practitioners, have you encountered these kinds of rituals in alcohol production? Such a beautiful question. And let me know if you want me to repeat that at all.
I think ritual is a really valuable concept for us to think with. So it reminds me of when you read a manual or an instruction booklet, sometimes there will be kind of pictures showing you, how to place your hands to do a certain thing, how to manipulate an instrument in a certain way. And there's a kind of breakdown of an action into its constituent steps, which can help you as a learner of a skill. And so when I read old microbiology manuals and textbooks, I kind of see the culture technique turned into a sort of a ritual for how to interact with the microbial life. I imagine there are similar things to be said about brewing practices as well.
One of the mottos that are shared by Japanese fermentation scientists is ask microbes and they will never betray you. So you just need to know how to ask them. But that pure culture process that Charles just described There is also a process called screening where you need to, it's a process of trying to find exactly the right microbe that you want in nature that will give you exactly the product that you want. And it's often seen as a very routine task because you have to go through like hundreds and hundreds of strains before you find the one that you want. But the design of it is actually very, very creative, but there's this ritualized aspect to it as well of, kind of going through this process, many, many times in order to find the right one. So a lot of scientific processes have this, procedural aspect to them, which can feel ritualized. But one more thing from brewers. Often gods were thought to make the sake, and so you would have a shrine in the brewery, and you would try to keep the brewery very clean. You would change into your shoes when you enter the brewery, and you sort of worship in front of the shrine, and so on. And some of that kind of perception that something was making the sake, that these sort of gods are making the sake, that I think that got transferred, somewhat to the microbes when it was found that they were being, they were these transformative agents as well.
I'm not sure exactly how to answer this one. I was thinking, like, what do I do? Ritualistic. There's some, well, for one thing, I put this nuduk out in the sun for days to irradiate in the sun so that, the aflatoxins break down. Now, but that's a very, now, because I'm in California and the sun rays are stronger, I don't know if, some people say, putting the nuduk out in the sun for a few hours in the heat will be enough. But I suppose because I was taught, you do it for days. So if it's not raining and it's not heavily polluted, I will sometimes leave it out for days, and you cover it and you let it out in the sun and you do it, you let it get some of the dew and the mist, and then it dries out in the sun. These are things you do. And I guess that it's more of the sincerity, your dedication expressed in the ritual that you hope will, produce delicious alcohol. But yeah, those are some of the things that I do. And, it would be wonderful to engage in this with others.
That was just so beautifully put. And I think part of what I heard too is how is the practice also ritualistic in different ways, right? And Yong Ha, I want to actually give you a chance to answer. I know in the last question from Jeffrey U. Warren about how your Makgeolli brewing has been shaped by, living in the U.S. Did you want to address that at all?
Yeah, I think this is I forgot to respond to this latter part of that question. Well, for one thing, my first drinking experiences were, even though it was in Korea, when I grew up in Korea until I was 5, and my grandma would, for fun, with her friends, when they hang out, they would give me dok, rice cake, and makgeolli, and they would see me get drunk. But, when I got older and started drinking alcoholic beverages, it wasn't makgeolli. You drink really terrible beer in college, or wine coolers, all sorts of things that I guess, like, White Claw equivalents when you're in your 20s, and wine. But I think, because I did grow up in the States, and I personally love very, very tart, acidic, minerally white wines. That's my thing. So while going for that sort of characteristic in Korean alcohol isn't considered traditional, that's not how most brewers do it. And in fact, some brewers in Korea who've had my stuff, they say it's gone bad, like, you know, like it's like vinegary because it's a little bit too sour. But I think in the California context, I like it. it's my Western influence that gets expressed in 술 too.
Thank you so much for sharing. So before we close, I wanted to also just offer this time, if you know, Yong Ha, Victoria, and Charles just want to offer like a last note or anything in terms of, you know, anything that wasn't addressed that you would just want to briefly share with the audience before we close. It's completely okay if there isn't either.
Oh, maybe I would like to suggest that or to end by articulating my enthusiasm for Yong Ha's work and my appreciation for her inviting me to participate in today's conversation, and my eagerness to taste her sul in days to come, and hopefully that we can raise a glass together when the pandemic has. When the situation permits. I would love to raise a glass together.
Yes.
Yeah, and the same here. It was a lot of fun for me to be here, and I already sort of thought the whole question of traditionality and heritage and nation and, you know, purity, pure culture, and species. I already thought that these were very complicated questions, but then the more, you know, I talked to Charles and Yong Ha about this, they become even more complicated. So and rich. That's been very exciting for me.
Likewise for me. I've learned so much, and in the process of preparing for this conversation, I've been going through your academic articles, and it's been so much fun to be able to have this conversation as a way of culminating my earlier academic interests, theoretical interests, but also in this interesting space of navigating how to do this as an entrepreneur. So there are all sorts of questions there. But this conversation is definitely, you know, getting me to think about all sorts of issues. And thank you so much. And thank you, Active Cultures and Kyopo, for this opportunity for people to hear slightly, you know, less essentialist perspectives on brews tinged with national characteristics.
Well, thank you so much again, Yong Ha, Victoria, and Charles, just on behalf of Active Cultures and also Kyopo. So just as a closing, I want to remind our audience that this conversation it's recorded, so it'll be live streamed, and it'll be also available, on AC's and Kyopo's Vimeo and YouTube channels, and then to our respective websites. I want to sincerely thank Domain LA and Jill Bernheimer, and also Hannah Makgeolli, founder Alice Chun, for partnering with us and making available Alice's delicious takju for today's program. And for those who might not have been able to get a bottle for today's event, we couldn't be more excited that there was such enthusiastic demand for this beautiful small batch product. So after today, I would just encourage all of you to seek out and ask about access to craft makgeolli like Alice's, you know, within your neighborhood wine shop. And I know that Jill, along with some of her wonderful peers here in LA, would like to also know of your interest in this practice and product, which of course are so deserving of support and attention. And then lastly, I want to thank former Kyopo steering committee member, Kavir Moon, who really initiated this dialogue between Yong Ha and Kyopo back in 2019, pre-pandemic. And Kavir actually wrote the wonderful text for AC last summer too. And all of our amazing current Kyopo committee members who have helped make this event happen. And I want to thank in particular all of our participants here today, as well as Eugene, Grace, Eileen, Anna for backend tech, and Bianca Moran for programming support before we sign off. So before I do, I just want to, I don't have Makgeolli, unfortunately, but I have some water here. So I just want to toast to all of you and cheers, and hopefully, when the situation's safe enough, we can all toast together. So cheers. Thank you so much. Thank you for the audience for joining us today.